Well, welcome everyone. My name is Haley. I am part of the Queens DSA branch in the New York chapter. I'm here with Andy from the Madison, Wisconsin chapter, and we are both with the Tempest Collective, which is a revolutionary socialist collective. It includes members who are both in and out of DSA. And we're here to talk about a document that we released called For a Democratic DSA. um, basically a statement which pretty much aims to try to figure out how we can get towards a DSA that is, well, in the title, more democratic. So I'm going to let Andy go ahead and take it away, give us a little bit of an intro, what the motivation for this document is, and then we're going to go through what it actually says. And finally, we'll have plenty of time for questions, discussion, anything that people want to hear about. We're happy to help answer and clarify. So with that, go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, so we put out this document about 2 weeks ago now. It's called For a Democratic DSA. The reason why we're putting it out now, obviously, is because the 2021 convention of the Democratic Socialists of America is coming up. Proposals are all due on April 1st. So we wanted to, as part of the convention, put out like what's a vision for DSA as we move forward. There's been a lot of experiences over the last 2 years, definitely, but 6 years really since DSA kind of blew up, where we've like experimented with the organization and tried to deal with making it kind of our own as new people that have come into DSA. So a lot of this is actually not very new. Some of these are proposals that had come up either in 2017 or 2019. And some of it is really just us trying to put out like a totalistic vision, right? Like democracy matters, right? And if we're socialists and we're democratic socialists, then democracy isn't just like you vote for somebody and then you let them do whatever for a couple of years and then you vote for somebody new if you didn't like it, right? I mean, we're talking about a radical vision of democracy that's about the people rule, right? Democracy. And so within our own organization, our experience, and I think a lot of people's experience, has been that often regular members don't run the organization, right? We don't determine the course of direction. We don't really debate and decide on what are the political policies that we're going to take up. So what we're trying to do is put together something that breaks this down bit by bit and says like, how does the organization function and how could it function differently? So what we're really looking for is talking about maximizing participation among members and maximizing democracy. And that we're also, we're not talking about like eliminating representative structures, right? Like all of us, I think, would understand that like not everybody can be involved all the time, right? Like that's a totally maximalist perspective, right? Like people live their lives, not everybody can be involved in everything. And if we tried, some of that might actually be less democratic. So we're talking about like, where are the avenues that most people can plug in, right? Like we can always improve on that stuff. So that's really the motivation of the document to begin with. And having like a perspective both about socialism, which is about democracy being extended to every facet of life, and having an organization where we prepare our members in the practice of democracy to take out to the rest of the work that we do. And also, talking about inside our organization, specifically about what are the structures and what kinds of things do they produce.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Andy. I'm just going to add a little bit, and then I'm actually going to go through the proposal itself. So some of this is in the statement, but in case anybody hasn't had a chance to read it, basically part of the background to this proposal is that DSA as a group wasn't originally conceived of as a mass member-led organization. It was designed more like a nonprofit, which of course not all nonprofits are bad, but they tend to have a top-down structure which is meant to give executive directives, and it's not designed for wider participation. And we know today DSA is substantially different in terms of both the size of the organization and the character, being a mass, multi-tendency organization. And that's a wonderful thing. but there's still some holdovers from this original structure that we think aren't meeting the needs of a mass democratic membership organization. And so as a basic question of expanding democracy as much as possible in terms of making DSA as responsive to its membership as possible, we want to see if we can increase the avenues for members who aren't directly on leadership bodies, but who nevertheless we want to have a say and to participate in significant political decisions of the organization. So with that, I'm going to go through what the statement actually says. I'm going to share my screen so that folks can see. All right, you can see my PowerPoint here.
Yep.
Okay, fantastic. All right, so here's what is actually in the proposal, and we're going to go through and clarify some of that as well. So 1, DSA needs more spaces for members to participate in discussions of strategy. There's currently a large gap in decision-making power between the leadership and rank and file members of the organization that needs to be overcome. Major political questions should be brought to the membership to debate and vote on, similar to the poll on the 2020 Sanders campaign endorsement. There should be more transparency and reports. National Political Committee and Steering Committee are not currently required to report information like minutes and votes to the members. Members must be informed of the dates and times of NPC, that is National Political Committee and Steering Committee meetings well in advance. There should be a right to recall. Members do not currently have the right to recall local and national leaders, which means that in practice, leaders are unaccountable to the membership of the organization. The right to recall is a democratic norm for socialists that we should insist on in DSA, in our unions, and in all other organizations that we are part of. And it continues. Members should elect leaders. The NPC currently appoints members to fill vacancies between conventions, which gives the standing NPC the power to decide on behalf of the membership who should lead the organization. Again, this means that the leadership is not accountable to the membership it is intended to represent. Members must have clear avenues to present petitions to elected leadership. Currently, members must rely on having an inside connection to an NPC member who will support their proposal. Budgets and budgetary priorities should reflect convention decisions. The elected leadership has the responsibility of appointing top administrative positions. No such appointments should exceed the term of the elected leadership. As soon as practicable, all leadership of working groups and committees should be elected by members of those bodies. Currently, the appointed leaderships of some working groups and committees have failed to convene elections. Basic requirements for the internal democracy of chapters must be established. After an initial chapter is approved, there should be agreed upon democratic protections that every chapter must abide by, including democratic election of convention delegates. All right, now we're moving to section 2. The leadership structure must change to be more representative of and accountable to the growing membership. Members should be actively involved in shaping both local and national strategies rather than passive receivers of strategies decided by leadership. Chapters and branches must ensure horizontal member-to-member communication. Significant minority perspectives should be allowed representation in DSA social media and publications. DSA should be run by members, not leadership. And finally, section 3. DSA needs an improved grievance process. Due process must be guaranteed to every member of the organization. Grievances should be heard and decided within 30 days. In grievances involving allegations of violence or sexual harassment/assault, it should be up to the grievant if they want to maintain confidentiality. In all other grievances, confidentiality should not be used as a shield to prevent political discussion and accountability. A member in good standing who has a grievance filed against them should have rights to see the grievance and to see and respond to any evidence that has been presented against them. National grievance and harassment officer positions should be elected by the convention. They should not be outsourced to a firm that will run the grievance processes like a human resource department. This role must be carried out by members independent of the NPC. And finally, the National Grievance and Harassment Officer must not have the right to amend or change the grievance process. So I know that's a lot of info, but we're going to go through a bit of it. And again, we'll have some time to answer questions. I'm going to let Andy go through a bit of that, and I'll stop sharing my screen.
So, so when we put out this document, right, you always have this tension, right, where you want something to be short enough to be read and substantive enough that like it's actually understood and can capture everything, right? And what we want to do in, at this part of this discussion really is like go through like what are we talking about, what do we mean, make sure that like we're not leaving things ambiguous or something like that, right? So basically this broke up into 3 sections, right? One of them being like the political direction of DSA needs to be run by members, right? I've written a lot about how DSA works and its kind of developments over the last few years. And what you end up seeing, right, like, is that often we either approve everything and so nothing is a priority, or priorities come from the top levels of elected leadership, right? So like the NPC is like, we're going to have a campaign on X for this amount of time, right? They decided that's what's going to happen. Like, okay, you know, like you might agree with it, you might disagree with it, but it's important for us as members of a socialist organization together to be like, what are the important things that we're thinking about, right? Like, what are the things our organization should work on? The second part of this document, or I mean, and there's a lot of overlap between 1 and 2 because it's difficult to separate the like political task from some of the like structural ones, right? Because there is a relationship. But the second one is trying to say that as much as possible, right, our leadership structure needs to be an extension of the will of the membership, right? Not something that is a separate layer that kind of is its own interest. And I'm not saying that to personalize anything, right? Like I agree with some people, I disagree with people. There are times where there's somebody from a political tendency that does something that I like, and other times where they do something that I don't like. All right, it's not to me about like a one-to-one power kind of correlation, but we're talking about like, all right, so if we get beyond like this kind of power interest thing, like how our structures should be really taking us out and executing the vision and the priorities that members have, right? So we both need to, 1, have members be deciding, right, and be part of the process of that, and 2, have a leadership that will execute it, and like that our process for having leaders, right, is that it's not like we just kind of say like wind them up and let them go and then see what happens, right? It's like that we want to make sure that we have mechanisms in place that they are actually executing those tasks. And the third one takes a little bit of a different tack, right? But this is about the grievance process. And the grievance process in particular was introduced in 2017. If I recall, it was not amended in 2019. But everybody has had some kind of experience, I think, at this point, and seen the limitations of the existing process, right? Both as people who are filing grievances or survivors, and other people who who've had grievances filed against them, and the process has been kind of all over the place, and I would say nobody is happy, right? So like trying to set up a minimum of what should a grievance process be. So before I launch in any more of that, Haley, do you want to weigh in on stuff?
Sure. I mean, I guess I'd like to just put all of this in a slightly broader context, because I think, you know, while this is all pertinent to DSA, and I think, Andy, you should come back and say a little bit more about how this pertains to DSA in particular. But I guess I'd just like to say a little word about how this pertains to the socialist movement in general, both in and out of DSA, in terms of what kind of society are we fighting for? And like, why does it matter that our organizations actually structures that mirror where we want to go? So we already live with bourgeois democracy, right? Which is like the most passive institution that you could possibly participate in. In other words, you vote, and then someone else is basically in the driver's seat for you, making all the decisions. And you're just hoping that they all take the right directions. And every 2 to 4 years, maybe you get to vote them out. But there's not an actual active participation in those decisions. That's the worst example of what a so-called democracy could look like. But by contrast, when we're talking about socialism and democracy and the importance of democracy to socialism, it goes back to the very origins of the socialist tradition. And the idea, going all the way back to Marx, that socialism is the self-emancipation of the working class, meaning it's an act of the working class itself. Nobody else can do it for them. And therefore, winning socialism actually requires mobilizing the widest numbers of people in deciding what we do. And it requires greater democracy to actually succeed than what currently exists within the bourgeois state. So that also matters for our organizations, whether that's a socialist organization, a union, a nonprofit, any kind of organization. We are always criticizing the current atomization, or the current bureaucratization rather, of unions and nonprofits, because they aren't as responsive as they need to be to our, the membership, who's affected by those decisions, right? So anywhere we are as socialists, we should be fighting for the greatest possible democracy. And that doesn't just mean the right to vote in representatives, again, who will make decisions on our behalf. It's actually about really training people to think through the debates, to be fully informed of what they are, whether that's a minority position or a majority position, to understand what direction do we think that we should go in as a whole. And leaders have the role of helping to carry that out. And if they're not, there should be a right to recall. That right actually goes all the way back to the Paris Commune. One of the first things that they instituted was not just term limits, but also the right to recall. I think that there are some practical examples in terms of DSA where both this question of the will of members matters, but also this question of the right to recall matters. So in New York City, we had a petition basically in solidarity with Tara Reid, who of course is the survivor of sexual assault by Joe Biden, who's come forward, right? And we wanted to circulate this petition. Now, there may have been members who agreed with this, there may have been members who disagreed with this, but basically on pretty much a technicality within the leadership body in our chapter, we weren't able to actually circulate this petition as widely as we would have wanted, or to do so through the National Political Committee, who kind of just voted to not consider it. And so members didn't have an opportunity to actually think through and decide, well, what do we think as a whole should be done? So I think that's an example of where this matters practically. Another example, in Chicago, people may know that Vasquez, who's the alderman, who's a DSA member, and was elected to be an alderperson, voted for basically a bill that did not defund the police, that was an austerity budget, and he was censured by the executive committee of Chicago DSA. Now, I think for obvious reasons. They also voted, in retrospect, not to expel him. Now, I think that there are a lot of questions within that that aren't necessarily raised by the document that we're raising, so I don't want to get into all of the details of that. But I think what it shows is we have a leadership that is rather, we have someone who is meant to represent our organization, right, in a place of enormous power. And we're an abolitionist organization, and here is someone voting for more funding to the police. So there's a contradiction there, and there's a real question of what political accountability looks like. Because if we don't have the right to recall, if we don't have the right to say what political principles our leadership should be carrying out, and they're pretty much totally autonomous from that, then we actually don't have any meaningful means of enforcing real democracy within the organization. And so I think those are two examples of why this stuff matters in practice. So I'll leave it at that. Andy, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, on the subject of recall in particular, right? So back in 2017, people might remember that there was like a lot of momentum behind the convention in 2017. Everybody was very excited. And it really, I think, got about a day before people discovered then that they had elected somebody that was an organizer for police unions, Danny Fatante. and members just flooded the MPC at the time with requests that, they don't want any cop organizers on the leadership of the organization. Members actually had no right to recall this person, right? So, I mean, this is like, you could come up with an extreme example, and this is basically the extreme example, and it happened. So here we have something that is fundamentally not with the principles of the organization and the membership, and members have no power to then say this was a mistake. The person is clearly not representing the kinds of politics that we want, and we are now voting to recall them from the NPC. That power did not exist. And the only reason why that guy left is because he stepped down voluntarily, right? The NPC at the time didn't believe that they could or should remove him. And so this seems like a very basic thing, right? I mean, like our leadership should, we might have disagreements about different perspectives on things, but there are some fundamental things that like we really need to be able to ensure, right? That like if something steps outside of the lines of like the common politics of our organization, members need to have the right to recall them and say like, you actually do not represent us. If we don't have that, then we do have a separate layer, right? Like now we have all this distance, and the consequence is that it sows distrust and like kind of cynicism about the organization. And like if we're gonna be involved in the project that we are, right, then we can't just, we can't go into it if we're second guessing one another, or not I'm not saying second guessing, I guess more like if we don't have confidence in one another that like we're here for the same project, right? So I think what I'm going to do real quick is I'm going to go down this list through the things that are in there, try to give some description of them, and then talk about why they're important. So this first one where we talked about there's a gap in the decision-making power between the leadership and rank and file members of the organization. So like when there's any number of issues that have come up, right? Like I certainly have opinions about them, and like sometimes I think like the leadership does fine and they represent a position that I would be okay with, and other times they don't. But the issue is really more that like when we're talking about like what are the major directions that we need to be taking, or like the questions that are really going to affect us, there is not a mechanism right now that allows rank and file members to participate, right? And like what ends up happening is if you want to be involved in the direction of DSA, usually what happens is they say, join a committee, right? So you kind of have to have the time and the inclination to say, like, I'm now going to be part of somebody, right? I'm going to like spend a lot of my time to then be part of maybe like administrating a group, going to a bunch of meetings and whatever, right? And like if you are not interested or able to be part of a leadership body like that, then your ability to weigh in kind of is gone, right? Like now you just kind of whatever the people that have the time to do it, that's going to be the direction that we mostly go. And I don't think that this is like such a foreign concept, because we did have a mass referenda. It was advisory because we didn't have the mechanism to make it binding. But in 2019, at the beginning of the year, we did have a one member, one vote poll on should DSA endorse Bernie Sanders or not, right? Every chapter had the ability then to consider the question, debate it, host it, and allow members, right, whether they had all the time in the world or, they show up to a meeting here and there, but they care about the work of the organization. It allowed everybody to have a stake in the direction, right? And feel like if it went away that you didn't like, well, now right? Like this is the will of our organization, right? It's not something where you can chalk it up to like maneuvering or like power plays or something, right? So I like those sorts of things are extremely important, and we're in the 21st century, right? I mean, it's not like the old days where people are mimeographing shit, right? Like we have the ability to like do these votes pretty inexpensively and make this part of our political culture. And I mean, it seems like it's an amazingly like transformational experience to be part of a mass democratic thing like that.
Great, thanks, Andy. I'll say one final thing and then ask for people to weigh in with questions or comments, or try to get a sense of what people think. But to me, I just want to be clear. I think that what we're saying and what this document speaks to is, not just this. Like, obviously, we're calling for more transparency in things like having minutes from NPC meetings, as a matter of practice, actually be available to people, of knowing how these votes go, of it being something that people can weigh in on, not just at convention time, and that's the only time when the membership actually gets to speak, or rather, that elected delegates get to speak, but rather that this is something that we institute more regularly throughout DSA. I think that a lot of people, in terms of their experience in DSA, if you don't know someone on the NPC, or if you don't know someone on a leadership body, your daily activity in terms of DSA has almost nothing to do with what those leadership bodies say or do. And so, in other words, there's a kind of a disconnect really between the regular activity of members and big political decisions that could be made for the organization. And so it's not so much about, is there like a big distrust of comrades? People are going to totally abuse the system as it is. That's really not where it's coming from. Where it's actually coming from is to make it more of a two-way street. In other words, yes, leadership should be accountable to members, but also the best leadership, people with the best intentions, will not know what members actually think if there aren't more mechanisms for members to actually weigh in and for them to actually get a sense of what members think on any number of topics. And so they can't actually, even with the best intentions, carry out the will of the membership unless those things exist. And so that's what we're hoping to do with this proposal. So yeah. Go ahead, Andy.
So, I mean, some of the other things we can talk about a little bit more quickly. We've talked about the right to recall, right? But like sort of a precondition of having accountable members is what they're doing, right? And like by and large, we don't know what anybody's doing. Like there are some minutes, they're irregular, right? Like officially, like the NPC does have to let people know that there's going to be a meeting in advance of it. But those are like minimums, right? And so there's times where, well, we had 6 or 7 months where we had no reports whatsoever from the National Political Committee about what decisions did they make, right? So between June and December or January, we had nothing. So how can you hold anybody accountable? How can you get a sense of what your organization is doing if you don't know what the decisions are that are being made, and you certainly don't know who voted on it, right? So this is important, right? It's not just like about recall, but like next time that somebody's going to run, you want to know like how did they vote on the issues that matter to me. And if you don't have that information, you're robbed of your democratic right to participate in the organization, right? So like having much more transparency and being kept up to date about like what are the decisions, take a roll call every time. I mean, a lot of these people actually signed what was called the NPC Transparency Pledge at last convention. And that like I opposed it, like the pledge, because I thought it was a political move. But I mean, I agree with it in spirit, which is that be open about what you're doing, right? So for so many people to sign that and then we get this kind of information blackout, it becomes a real problem. So we can move from there onto some of the other structures, right? Like we should be electing leaders, and generally we should be having participatory bodies, right? Some of our national committees are appointed only. The international committee is appointed, it's not elected. And like the example that's often used as the more democratic one is the Democratic Socialist Labor Commission, which, yes, it's true, had an election for membership. I would question the method because it was, I mean, I wrote about it, but the method that they used essentially meant that most of the positions were selected before anybody cast a vote. But more to the point, right? Like what ends up happening is that members actually have no rights to participation in the DSLC. And so, right, like we might have a body that's elected, but we have hundreds, thousands of members that are labor activists, right? And how do we make decisions about what is going to happen in the labor body? We, in order to do that, we need both information about what's happening and also the ability for members to make decisions that are consequential, right? So that, like, that's not me trying to throw shade on what is a very difficult position, right? I've been in a lot of leadership positions where, people throw out criticism and you hate them for it because all you hear are problems. But it is really important for a democratic culture and a socialist organization in particular that members are weighing in and they have a stake in the decisions, because people aren't going to show up to do the work a lot of times if you just kind of drop like a pre-made campaign on them.
Yep, well said. All right, so why don't we move on to some questions from the chat? So I'm going to take just a second if people want to write out what they think or if people want to add. I know there's a couple already. We could take a few at a time. So, please feel free to write in any comments, questions, and we'll try to respond a bit. Do you want me to read out a couple of the ones we have so far? Here, let's do that. Okay, so I see one from, I see a comment from Abel. I think a key failure of the NPC is its size. 16 is too small a number, and having only minimum of 5 by POC and minority is too low a bar. I would double the number of NPC members. And then I have a question from Aaliyah. Can you talk a little bit about how you see the relationship between locals and nationals? You're focusing a lot on dynamics that are specific to a national DSA policy, but from my perspective, most of the action in DSA happens through locals. Is that something you want to see us move away from? How do you think the federalism issue relates to democratic structures?
Yeah, so I think the first thing that we really need to recognize, right, is your experience in DSA is overwhelmingly by your chapter, right? Like you come in and almost everything that you think that is like DSA culture and DSA practice has to do with how your chapter is established. And like chapters can be night and day different, right? Like you could be in one city and like hate your chapter and feel like it's alienating and it's not going a way that you like at all and the process doesn't work, and you move to another city and it feels like a completely different organization, right? And part of the issue really is that, like, as we wrote in a part of this document, is like there needs to be some more, like there needs to be a floor for what is the experience in DSA, so that way like people can expect, right, that like you're having a common kind of process, and that maybe the decisions that you make will be very contingent on like what your local situation is. But it's not as though like one chapter is like, oh well, we vote on every policy, and another one's like, we've never once done that, right? Like a thing that we put in this document was that an essential that every chapter must have is access to horizontal communications, right? Remember, like the whole basis of democracy is that people can talk to each other. And if there is no horizontal communications, like if there's not an email list or a Slack or whatever, that then you can't connect to other people. You can't share your ideas. You can't organize with other people to talk about what your vision is, right? So there are major chapters that do not have horizontal communication, right? You have other chapters where as soon as somebody joins the chapter, they're added to horizontal communication. So that way people can talk about, right, well, I'm thinking about doing this project and blah, 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 right? Like, and the difference that makes is pretty huge in terms of the democratic culture.
Yeah, I'll just add briefly. I think that there's obviously a lot that happens locally that can only be determined locally and should be determined locally by members. I also think there are a lot of instances where, at least, maybe this is just my experience, but I find myself saying, we have almost 100,000 members. We should be able to punch above our weight. We should be able to use that power that we have in cities all over the country to affect change when it comes to pressing national questions. So, or to decide not to. But the point is we should have avenues to actually make those decisions. So for example, after the Capitol insurrection, on January 6th, where there was storming of the Capitol, I know that I and other comrades felt that we should have had a more robust response to that in terms of confronting the far right and making it absolutely unacceptable for them to mobilize openly in the streets, for us to actually try to take a lead as one of the largest organizations on the left, or in fact, the largest organization on the left, in helping to call protests against that in every area. Is that something that everyone here agrees with? Maybe not. But the point is, there was no way for me to propose something like that as a response in a national way to an issue that couldn't have just been responded to locally, but was actually a national question. The same goes for close the camps protests. And abolish ICE. There are certain questions that are actually being posed not just locally, but nationally. And there's a lot of good local work that's being done around these questions, but there's not really a mechanism for us to say, hey, let's take this on as an organization. This is actually something that it will matter if socialists are all over the country taking a lead on. And so the only way that we end up taking those leads currently is if the NPC decides to encourage chapters to do that through its bulletins every so often. But there's no way to do it in the opposite directions where members can raise a proposal and say, here's something that we think we should be prioritizing nationally, unless it's at convention. And so in between convention, I think there needs to be more spaces for us to actually be able to raise these proposals that have national weight and significance, and that actually allow us as members to decide this is something we think really matters for us to do, and there's urgency around it.
Yeah, and the last thing on that is really that I think that people's experience is so localized because of the absence of this kind of national democratic structure, right? Where, like, for most people, you join DSA, right? Like, maybe you get some emails from Maria or some shit like that. But like everything that happens is what happens in your chapter, right? Like, and you might jump on a call or something like that. But like, as far as most members are concerned, their chapter is where the things that like matter are happening. And so like, it creates like, it's a learned divestment from the national organization because there's no mechanism to really participate, right? So like, if we like, one of the things about evening some of those experiences, like, yes, is that every chapter should have the right to recall, and every chapter should have, horizontal communications and like some standards that all members, no matter where you are, can really expect. But also that like, no matter where you are, you also have an opportunity to participate in the policy and direction of the organization. And if that's absent, then all that's going to happen is people talking about the experience of their chapter, right? Like, if you're not having a discussion about, okay, well, this major event is happening and we're thinking this or that, right? Then what does it matter? So like, kind of like the purpose ends up developing a lot of that stuff. And if we don't have that, then so much of it ends up being like this federalism, and it's a collection of chapters rather than a cohesive organization.
Cool. So let me take the next two questions. So I see one from John. What do you mean or envision when you want staff to change with the terms of elected leaders? And then from Claire, I'm curious if you have info on how the Tempest statement is being received by rank and file DSA members.
Do you want to start?
You can start.
All right. So this thing about that we wrote about the staff, right, is not about like, who's your organizer and, do you want this person or not this person, right? It's that the top level administrative staff of the organization have an enormous amount of influence over what happens in the organization, right? That the executive director, who's currently Maria, has been there since before the big bump of membership, right? And so people like that, I mean, like anybody that ends up having that position, the position itself holds so much information, and it really enables an elected leadership to do something or not, right? And so it shouldn't be a given that we will perpetually have the same people, right? That if you're like, okay, this is the direction that we're choosing for this organization, then, you know, one of the proposals that we're suggesting here is that the leadership should really consider at the time that they start, is this the executive director or whatever? Like, do you want to open this up? Or do you want to are you content and feel like the job that somebody has been doing is going to be sufficient for the vision that you have, right? That you've been elected to execute. So that's the distinction that we're making. We're not talking about like, oh, somebody in the office should just like go every 2 years or something like. Not at all, right? We're very much talking about the people that hold a lot of this institutional knowledge and direct the staff, and yeah.
Yeah, I think you answered that one well. I'm going to try to answer Claire's. So, you know, my impression is that it's being received pretty well. I have heard a lot of positive feedback from people. I think especially people who have had sort of the experience that I've mentioned, where it's like, especially if you're a newer person to DSA, but even if you've been here for a while, it's there's sort of like a learning curve to be able to figure out how the structures work, even with all of the intro sessions, which are really wonderful that people do. Where I am in New York, it's still very difficult to figure out, well, what are the mechanisms for me to raise a proposal if I don't personally know someone in the leadership or have a relationship with them, especially when it comes to national questions. You know, I know other chapters may be more responsive than others, but I think that when we're speaking nationally, that can be a real challenge. And so that's a very, you know, maybe unintentionally, but I think it's a very personalistic way to do politics, that it has to be based on this personal relationship rather than it being, I'm a member of DSA, I've committed to help build this organization and make it better and to do work to build socialism in the US. You know, that is our common project. And that should be the basis on which someone who's committed to do that gets to decide, what do I think the organization should do? I have an avenue to, you know, to raise that with members, and other members get to see and think through what I've put forward and decide for themselves whether that's something we should be doing. So I think that, I think in that regard, it's been received well. I have heard some responses to the document that I think are more, you know, I think somewhat of a misunderstanding. So I'll try to clarify. For example, I think one interpretation of this is that it's a criticism of individual leaders or the way that current leadership is operating in DSA. I definitely don't think that's what we're going for at all. I think the intention is not a personalistic one or one that's criticizing individual leaders. It's saying that the more structures we have where members can actually weigh in and be active and not simply receive directives from leadership about what we should do, or sometimes not even receive information about what leadership has decided or what debates exist, even within leadership bodies. I think the more informed members are, the better strategic decisions we're going to actually be able to make about what, or, you know, what direction we want our organization to go in. Another is sort of that it's an almost like anti-leadership document. And I think we're all here definitely for leadership and for representation. It's not a criticism of that or a desire to say we shouldn't have any leadership, but rather to say that that leadership is not going to be actually democratic or accountable if we don't have things like the right to recall, especially in a high stakes situation like the one I mentioned around someone like Vasquez, who is a DSA member, who is holding a position, not just within DSA with weight, but actually within his city with a lot of weight. There should be protocols for that sort of thing. And it's not about that person. It's actually about what is the political will of the membership. So those are a few things I've heard. I don't know. What are you thinking, Andy?
Yeah, I mean, I think that like a lot of people kind of assume, wait, isn't that the way it is right now? You know, like often people are like, well, we say we're a democratic organization, so that must mean that we have all this good stuff, right? And you know, it sucks to kind of have to like pop the bubble and be like, nope, we don't actually have those things, right? So I think like, you know, it becomes really common sense, a lot of these things. Like what we're proposing, I don't think is like so crazy radical about shifting the direction of the organization. What we're talking about is often like making it in line with what the expectations a lot of people have about how a democratic organization should function. So, you know, it sucks when people take it personal because it's not intended to be, right? Like I would be kind of worried about being like, oh, okay, I'll just be at the head of an organization and I can solve all the problems, right? Like that's not how structural things work, right? It's that that they produce certain relationships and outcomes, right? And whether you're like the most hardened fucking revolutionary or you know you jumped into this yesterday, right? Like you're going to have a lot of the same outcomes with if the structure is how it is. So like being able to mitigate that and like to incorporate like democratic input regularly, right? Like allowing people to set the policy, right? Like directly in major instances, right? Like that sort of stuff is going to keep anybody honest, right? Like it's not about like whether like what somebody thinks about you personally as a leader if everybody in the organization voted to say this is what we're doing, right? Then it's like, okay, that's what's happening. So now it's about figuring that out.
Great. So again, if you still have questions, I'm just encouraging people again, especially if you just tuned in, we still have a little bit of time left for more questions. We have one here from Aaron. Why start with a focus on DSA structures? Isn't it more important to make proposals to help win concrete reforms? For example, for legislative reforms we should fight for, or strategies we should use in building a class struggle labor movement?
I'd love to hear your take, Haley.
Yeah, way to throw us a hardball here. No, no, I'm joking. So I think that a lot of the work that DSA already does is certainly about winning concrete reforms, whether those are legislative or, you know, within their labor organizing. But again, it's very, what I think is most difficult about the current structure of DSA is a lot of these discussions happen within caucuses or they happen on leadership bodies, but they don't actually happen in the working groups where the work gets done. And so very often we're focused on, we got to get this work done, we got to do this, but there's no stepping back to say, is this going to work? What strategies are actually going to win us the kind of demands that we want to see enacted? Where have we seen these strategies work in other places? Which ones actually strengthen our ability to connect with people who are doing work in communities and labor, whatever? I think that there are a lot of questions that go unanswered. And so the default strategy is let's just do this, legislative campaign. I'll give you an example. I do work around the movement to defund the NYPD. And there's often a tension, I think, between wanting to put forward a legislative strategy, which says, here's what we want, here's the package, let's try to lobby people to get it through, and trying to organize and connect and unite and work in coalition with all of the forces in the city that it would actually take to make those demands a reality and put pressure. And sometimes we're doing one and not the other, but we've never had a strategy discussion, and there aren't spaces within DSA to have a discussion about which one do we think is going to be most effective, what do we think we should be doing, how do we prove this in practice? And so if those discussions remain on leadership bodies and are only decided by leadership, or if they're only decided or discussed within caucuses and they're not actually brought out into the open, then members in the broader DSA don't actually have an opportunity to understand, weigh in, and buy into those and say, hey, I agree with that, or I really, I have a different opinion. Maybe, the other thing about democracy, right, is like, we do have more people weighing in. Sometimes someone will think of something that none of us have come up with that will be really convincing and really effective. And so the more these conversations happen to be open, it actually strengthens what our organization can do.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. I mean, no person can anticipate everything, right? And like seriously, like if we can't run an organization of 100,000 people like democratically, like how are we going to run a society? So like, I think like we really do need to start by considering, right, like how are we training ourselves and each other in the practice of democracy and being able to handle this stuff. But also like in this political moment, if you're like looking at this, like this is a very difficult time, like incredibly difficult. And and there's sure to be disagreements here. And like we want to make sure like that our organization survives, right? And that people have confidence in the direction that things go. So like, you know, it may be that I don't know, people are like, what we really need to do is this all, you know, major legislative thing, and I'll disagree. But if that's the way that the majority of people will go, I'll respect that, right? And whereas if I feel like, okay, well, the debate was suppressed, nobody had their chance to argue against it, or whatever, put forward an alternative, then people leave feeling really salty, right? A lot of people have just been like, there's no place in DSA for me to be able to like raise stuff, so I'm out, right? And it's completely not necessary. So like, if we're going to get people invested in the sorts of things that need to be done, then we have to be making those decisions together, and people have to feel like they're stakeholders. So I think that's the number one reason why I would put this before, you know, like a political vision about what do I think, right? Like, to me, like the precondition of being able to have a democratic decision is a democratic organization. And then after that, I'll tell you my position and I'll fight as hard as I can for it. And if you're not convinced, then, and you know, the majority aren't, then I've said my piece, right?
Just on Andy's last point, I think it's important too, because, you know, I think there are a lot of well, at convention, my understanding, I haven't actually been to a DSA convention yet, so correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is only a small number of proposals actually get voted on and discussed on the floor.
Yep.
And so often those will, you know, be more substantive, and that's understandable, and there should be substantive discussions. Not that this isn't substantive, but the organizational questions it raises, I think, are really important, and important for us to, you know, be able to show there's a lot of support for democratizing DSA because of all the things that Andy just raises, a precondition for us to do all the other things we want to do. So I'll just leave it at that. There are two other questions. I think we probably only have time for those. So why don't we go ahead and finish off with those? And thank you all, you know, for participating in the discussion. So from Nikhil, are there organizational or party models inside or outside the US we should learn from? I love that question. And then from John, I often see members who don't know how to practice democracy. Do you see the danger of power being given up by members no matter what the structure? Is this about democratic culture?
Do you want to take a first crack?
Sure. Those are both great questions. So I'll start with the one about party and organizational models. So in terms of, you know, I think one challenge we have is just how undemocratic the US is. Even in terms of, I mean, the Democratic and Republican parties are not real parties in the traditional way that parties are structured in almost any other country. I went to Australia a little while ago and was kind of trying to wrap my head around what people meant when they said, are you a member of the Democratic Party? And being a member of a party in the US really just means you vote for a Democrat, or you vote Republican, or you vote Green, or for whoever. And there's no actual forums where people get to discuss, well, what should the platforms be? Well, what should what are the concerns of ordinary people? It's just kind of incumbent on you to hope that maybe one of the candidates cares about those things. And so that's already a really difficult starting point, really being able to, you know, expose just how undemocratic the US is, but also to provide alternatives in what we do, whether it's a pre-party organization, which is what I hope something like DSA can be, but also in terms of not having this kind of experience in most people's ordinary lives. And so I think that knowing that that should actually be the norm, or being able to say that should be the norm, that, you know, whatever party structures we have, they should actually be as participatory as possible. They should actually include being a member should mean that your voice actually matters and that we want to know what you think. But also, I think for socialists, it's even that much more important. I know that the term cadre organization often has a negative connotation, but I'm going to use it here just because I feel like what we actually need is for our members to feel empowered, to feel like they're leaders wherever they are, whether it's in their workplaces or on a literal leadership body in DSA, for us to actually train people and not just say there's a finite number of people who have leadership skills or administrative skills, and these are the only people who can be on leadership bodies in DSA. No, everybody has different skills, and we should actually be trying to train people with the knowledge that every working class person can lead, every cook can rule, everybody is able to do that if we're actually invested in providing those things that our society so often divests us from and tells us that we're not able to do, or that only rich people or politicians know how to do. So we should try to get away from that, I think, and start to build our own model here that is an alternative for others.
Yeah, I mean, I love every cook can govern. I mean, in the sense that it's like what bourgeois democracy prepares you for is you elect your betters, right? Like you are not capable of ruling yourselves, little pleb. Like, but the kind of democracy we're talking about, right, is that like every ordinary person, every working person has the capacity to understand and govern themselves and make decisions, and so much of this is about, do you have the access to it? Do you have is there actually that input solicited? Like, does anybody actually make it possible for you to do that, right? If you live in a system like our general system, right, where nobody wants to hear what the fuck you have to say about anything, then of course you're going to be divested of it. And like, there's a danger in an organization that is structured around a nonprofit model where you kind of do the same thing. I mean, I'm not going to like say like our organization is 100% representative, like reflective of, the evils of bourgeois democracy, but we're all people that are trained by the society we come up in, right? And so we have to learn democratic skills and stuff. But it's not like, I don't think it's sufficient to this second question about just saying that there's going to be a democratic culture, right? Like, culture develops around the structures and the practices that you have. And so, sure, sometimes it can help inform new ones, but it's not usually that relationship, right? And so we can't wait for the culture. We have to provide a reason, right? We have to make it so that way, here is the structure that if you have so many people and you have a proposal that you want to have come in front of the whole organization, right, that you should have that possibility, right? Or if you want it to come in front of the NPC, right? Like, if you can find 1,500 people that agree that this is an important question, that's a lot of people, right? That should be sufficient to really do that. And like, when you make that a guarantee of your organization, right, it creates that investment and that sense of ownership. I'll say about what organizations I think we can learn from. One that I found really inspirational personally is the Left Bloc out of Portugal, which I mean, like the story of the organization is great. We don't have a lot of time, so I'll just make it short. But basically, it was that they, out of the failure to reform the abortion law in Portugal, which is a very Catholic country and has been staunchly against abortion, the left at the time was like, we're atomized, we're all over the place, right? Like, we can't win if we're some Maoists here and some Trots and whoever else, right? We need to have a bloc. And so they formed an organization, like a party called Left Bloc, and managed to create something that was sufficiently big tent to say, like, here is the common thing that all of us can agree on, right? Like, we're not frontlining ideology as like the thing that every single person has to agree, this is the character of what was the Soviet Union or whatever. What they talk about is like, this is the course of action that we have to take, right? These are the major things. And that like these other like subsidiary groups exist within them, and that those people are like, if you like what we do, then you can learn all about our ideology, right? That I think has been a really effective model, because it's based around like, who's got the best proposal for action, And yeah, sure, sometimes you have to debate about what needs action, but I think that something like that is really useful. Like it gets us out of a sectarian mindset where it's like, oh, those people are wrong because they think this, right? It's like somebody might have an idea, like a tradition I don't agree with, and land on a gold mine of an idea, right? Like it happens. So
All right, well, we are close to the end here. Before we close out, I do want to make sure that people know that we, in the spirit of everything we've said and democracy, we would love to have people, if you like what you heard, if you think that you're in support of this, or even if you just want to hear more about the kind of proposals that Tempest Collective is coming up with, and potentially to sign your name onto it and support. We have a little bit.ly which I'm sure is being posted as we speak. Basically, we just like people to follow that, and it's a way for you to sign up to hear more about future proposals, and also to be able to sign your name once the proposals are prepared. So these are the statement we have is sort of a preliminary draft of the kind of proposals that we're going to be making in more detail and more concretely. So again, if you like that, if you want to vote for it, if you want to put your name on it, please sign up there. And, hopefully, again, I guess I'll just say one last thing, which is another thing. If you like what you hear, Tempest Collective is a membership group. It is both based inside and outside of DSA. We're basically united by strategic agreement around the question of socialism from below, the idea that workers need to actually rule themselves and be the ones who are part of shaping their own destiny. So if you like that stuff, you should also check out our website, tempestmag.org. You can read stuff that we've written, get more perspectives, and hear more about us, and also consider joining. So we have monthly strategy and perspectives discussions and things that people can participate in. And even if you're not a member, there are public meetings like this one that we try to have pretty regularly so that people can engage and have these discussions and debates right out in the open. So with that, I think we're done here. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate tuning in.
Take care. Thank you.